And if you want to be one of those 3 to 4 metros in phase 2 of the study, you can stand right behind me. Baltimore wants to be first up. Next up is Manuel Pasteur. And I actually got to first experience Manuel 2003, 2004. I can't remember when it was, but Uncommon Common Ground came out. It was a book that he co-authored with Angela Gulliver Blackwell and Stuart Quo. And there's a updated edition of Uncommon Common Ground out now. Dr. Pasteur is a professor of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. He's the founding director of the Center for Justice, Tolerance, and Community at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he currently directs the program for environmental and regional equity at USC. And he's also the co-director with Anne-Marie Hancock of USC Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration. He holds an economics PhD from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and has received fellowships from the Danforth, Guggenheim, and Kellogg Foundations and grants from the Irvine Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the National Science Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the California Environmental Protection Agency, and the W.T. Grant Foundation, the California Endowment, the National... So if you want to figure out how to get a grant, talk to Manuel. Dr. Pasteur speaks frequently on issues of demographic change, economic inequality, and community empowerment, and has contributed opinion pieces to such outlets as the Los Angeles Times, the San Jose Mercury News, and the San Francisco Chronicle. He served as a member of the Commission on Regions, appointed by California Speaker of the State Assembly, and in January 2002 was awarded a Civic Entrepreneur of the Year award from the California Center on Regional Leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Manuel Pasteur.
So I want to thank you for that. I want to thank you for that kind introduction, and also for mentioning the book. It is, by the way, called Uncommon Common Ground: Race in America's Future. It's available from Amazon.com. I believe Volution is going to be buying a copy for each one of you. I should also note that for those of you who are perhaps not readers, it's about to be made into a major motion picture. I was negotiating the rights just last weekend, and I almost was about to be portrayed by Antonio Banderas. Turns out it's George Lopez, but still, it's a pretty exciting thing. So if we want to understand the next American dream and how it relates to the issues that you're concerned about with walkability, transportation, smart growth, urban planning, we need to understand the next America. And if we want to understand the next America, we need to turn to a little bit of what's happened, what the statistics are from the most recent census. The most recent census, the 2010 census, tells us that between the years 2000 and 2010, the Latino population in the United States grew by 43%, that the Asian Pacific Islander population grew by 43%, that the African American population over that decade grew by about 11%, and the white population, non-Hispanic white, grew by only about 1%. 43%, 1%, you can tell that change is coming upon us. Interestingly, the main driver now behind that growth in the Latino population is not what most people think. It's not immigration. Immigration, in fact, has been tapering off to the country, not just in the last couple of years as a result of the economic recession and increased enforcement at the borders, but really as a result of changing demographic conditions in sending countries and changing economic conditions as well. Most significantly, the fertility rate in Mexico, which used to be about 5 kids per woman, has gone down to a little bit over 2, pretty close to U.S. rates over the last 20 to 30 years. Now, what that means is there's no longer as much of a demographic push from birth rates, and the economies of the developing world have actually been doing better, you might have noticed, than ours. And as a result, many of the push factors economically are declining as well. So very different growth rates. And you can see from this chart that the main contributor to the population change or population growth in the United States was actually folks of color. So in the 1980s, 34% of the net population growth in the United States came from white Americans. Now it's only around 8%, and most of the population growth is coming from people of color, most significantly 56% of that population growth from Latinos. Now this is a chart that shows you what's happening with kids. So for example, in the last census there was a net decline of white children in the United States of 4.3 million. That does not mean that 4.3 million young white people died. We would have noticed that. What that means instead, is, of course, is that people are graduating from that cohort of being kids, moving into being 19 and 20, and less are coming up through 0, 1, and 2. So the net decrease in white children in the United States of 4.3 million, net decrease of 250,000 of black children in the United States, a net increase of 4.8 million of Latinos, about 800,000 of Asian Pacific Islanders. That's the growth that's coming up the future. And this is happening in particular places in very interesting ways. So for example, in Texas, many Republicans were excited when they saw the growth rate of the population in Texas and the fact that Texas was going to get 4 additional congressional seats. And then they realized that 96% of the growth was coming from Latinos. So that presents some challenges for the Republican Party in Texas. So what does the demographics look like? Well, it's predicted now that by the year 2042, we will be a so-called majority-minority nation, or as I like to think of it, all minority all the time. By the year 2020, the majority of people under the age of 18 will be people of color, and it's probably this year that the majority of births are to people of color. So that's what's happening in the United States. And I want you to notice just 2 figures here. In 2000, the white population was 69% of the U.S. population. It's projected by 2050 that it'll be 46%. The reason I want you to remember that is to look at what happened in California between 1980 and 2000. Between 1980 and 2000, basically, we went through what the United States is going to go through between the year 2000 and 2050, i.e. in 1980, California, where I come from, we were about 67% white. We were about 47% white in the year 2000. So we became majority-minority sometime before the 2000 census. In fact, demographers say they know the exact day it happened. You know how they do that? They go, the 300 millionth baby was born today. His name is Jose. You're like, how did you know that? So on December 15th, 1999, I kept getting phone calls from reporters all day long saying, my God, we're majority-minority, majority-minority. What's it mean? What's it mean? What's it mean? There was a tone of anxiety. And finally, I got kind of frustrated and said, I don't know. But we're having a salsa party at my house tonight to celebrate. In the spirit of the new California, everyone's invited. They just need to learn a new step. And some of you who've been to salsa dancing classes know what I'm talking about, right, before the club. So that's part of what we're doing, is learning a new step, and I want to kind of bring that new step in just a few minutes into this debate about walkability, smart growth, etc. But first, hope this still works, one important thing for you to realize, and this gets to this thing about drivers. If you think that California has been through this before the rest of the country, and it has, there's one thing you really want to notice. The share of foreign-born in California is on the decline. The share of foreign-born in Los Angeles has been on the decline for the last 2 to 3 years. What's happening instead is a second and third generation population. Of the 100 large metropolitan areas in the United States, What metro area do you think is the only metro area of the 100 largest metro areas that did not see an increase in the number of Hispanic children? LA. Does that square with the popular perception? No. They imagine that not only is LA continuing to grow in terms of Latinos, that eventually it'll become 150% Latino, right? Sort of super Latinos crossing the landscape. So demographic change as we move forward is actually going to be driven not by immigration, but by the second and third generation, and it's going to be happening all over the United States. One state that always strikes me is that Utah is now 13% Latino. But basically, we've seen a real shift into the rest of the country. What's this look like geographically? This is a set of maps that we just did with PolicyLink. My shop, the Program for Environmental and Regional Equity, did with PolicyLink. And we looked at counties in the United States that were greater than 50% people of color. Tipping point counties, ones that were between 40 and 50%, because when you look at demographic change over time, those look like the sort of tipping points, and then the lighter areas were less than 40% people of color. This is what the map looked like in 1980 by counties. This is what the map looked like in 1990, in 2000, and the most recent census. Here's where it's projected to go in 2020, 2030, and finally 2040. So don't worry if you don't have a good taqueria near you now. One is coming. And you'll also notice that those areas that are light here and white here are also areas where there's not a lot of people, right? So we're seeing that the population is going to be much more diverse, particularly in our large metro areas. A couple of other things, what the census just revealed, which is very interesting. There's not just this geographic dispersal of Latinos all over the United States, and actually some very interesting movements of African Americans back to southern areas and increasingly into the suburbs as well. But this is part of the thing I want to bring up, is the increased suburbanization of so-called minority communities. So, for example, in 1980, and this chart's a little bit hard to read, but I'll just tell you what the big point is. For the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the United States, their suburbs are exactly America's demography. Before, the suburbs used to be a lot whiter than America. Now the suburbs, for at least the large metro areas, have a significant share of African Americans, of Latinos, of Asians, etc. So increased suburbanization, that's one issue. Another issue that's going on that's a very interesting sub-issue has to do with the increased proximity of African Americans and Latinos in our major urban areas, the groups that are moving into closest residential proximity. So, for example, this is close to where I work, USC, South Los Angeles, and instead of just showing you the demographics, I'll instead show you the high school demographics. These are the classic high schools in South LA as of 1981, 1982. And so you can see that there were schools, if you know Los Angeles, like Crenshaw, Dorsey, Fremont, Jefferson, Jordan, Locke, Manual Arts, Washington Prep. So Manual Arts, for example, was about 2/3 African American. Locke, the third from the right, was about 98% African American. Look what this demography looks like in 2008, 2009. I'm going to do that again because I liked it when you said ooh. So Manual Arts goes from about 2/3 African American to being 81% Latino. Locke goes from being 98% African American to being 2/3 Latino. Dramatic changes in these urban areas. One little sub-point, by the way, in 1981, 1982, in these South Central high schools, there were exactly 37 white students. 2008, 2009, there were exactly 37 white students. We think they're the same students. And I'm planning on adding to my foundation portfolio by launching a new research project called Leave No Child Behind, which will be trying to investigate this phenomena. A couple of other things on the way to thinking about what the implications are for smart growth. First, while most folks have focused in on the question of that 43% growth rate versus 1% growth rate, the really significant data point from the census is the difference in median age. Median age, people half older, for a group means half the folks are older, half the folks are younger. For non-Hispanic whites, the median age in the United States is 41 years. For Asian Pacific Islanders, it's 35 years. For African Americans, it's 32 years. For Latinos, it's 27 years. 41, 27, 14 years. That's basically a generation gap. It also means, if you think about it, that growth rate is coming from kids because the median age is 27, family formation, and that this is an important market to be taking a look at. That generation gap, having a much wider old and a much browner young, actually does make a difference. What state in the United States do you think has the biggest demographic generation gap, the widest old, the brownest young? Florida, good guess, wrong. Arizona. And is it any wonder that they have such tensions around all sorts of different things? So you can see that this generation gap has actually been growing over time between the old and the young. And I want to think a little bit about what are the implications of these various data points I've just talked to you about, and then conclude with a sort of rousing and emotional conclusion. So the first is that this gap between the old and the young actually has consequence. We've tried to take a look at the states where the gap between the old and the young, the demographic gap, is the largest, where the share of those above the age of 65 who are white is much different than the share of those below the age of 18 that are white. What do you find out? You find out that in the states that have the largest gap between the old and the young, basically education spending per capita is the lowest. The old are not seeing themselves in the young. You also find that in the states where the gap between the old and the young is the biggest, capital infrastructure is the lowest in terms of spending per capita. So that demographic gap, that gap between the old and the young that needs to be repaired, is actually causing an underinvestment in human capital and in physical capital. And that's going to be part of addressing the kind of remaking of the physical landscape that Chris was talking about. The second thing, and this graph kind of illustrates it, but I'll just tell you it, is that we need to reimagine what we mean by smart growth. When we think about smart growth and walkable communities, we tend to think about things like people who are using lots of public transit, places where there's lots of retail amenities on the street, places where people tend to live in crowded conditions and tend to have porches and stuff that's open to the streets. Does that make sense? So that's East Los Angeles, right? Except there's taquerias and not cappuccino bars, right? And we need to build on the fact that lots of immigrants actually have preferences for living in these cities. What this shows you is the use of public transit and basically even controlling for the level of income. More recently arrived immigrants tend to be bigger users of mass transit. It takes a while to beat the use out of them, right? And to turn them into the suburbanites that the rest of us are. And instead of trying to steer a lot of preferences back to the city, why don't we take advantage of the populations that are already there and figure out what the conditions are that are necessary to keep them in the cities. And one of the most important conditions that's necessary to keep them in the cities is addressing the questions of education so that people do not move out when they begin to have kids and think about where they're going to school. Now, we are being helped. We have wind at our back in terms of this immigrant community, and we also have wind at our back in terms of the new generation. And that wind at our back is primarily because a lot of young people who essentially either tried to buy a home and saw themselves get burned by the real estate crash, or basically see that this is no longer a viable way to sort of build wealth over time, have begun to think about staying in the city, renting the city, in the city, and not really moving out to suburbs. They're seeing value in living closer to work. And what we're finding in California is that while the sort of inland markets, like the Inland Empire and Stockton, places where people drove till they qualified, that those markets have collapsed, and what has retained some value has been the coastal communities. And so now UCLA's economic forecasts are building this in. As Jerry Nicholsberg from UCLA Annenberg forecast said, we haven't overbuilt, we just built in the wrong place. And the incremental demand for housing is moving more into multifamily housing. So we have some wind at our back if we can create the kinds of physical conditions that Chris was talking about. We are trying to do this in California and in Los Angeles. In California, we have SB 375, which is mandating better coordination between transportation planning and land use planning. That's going to provide a kind of policy wind at our backs for trying to do more walkable communities. In Los Angeles, too, we also find ourselves or we don't find ourselves, we were able to vote for something called Measure R, which is an additional sales tax so that we can build more transit in Los Angeles. And now we're trying to do something called 30-10, which is to try to get the federal government to lend us the money to build 30 years of public transit infrastructure in 10 years. To do that because of the economic benefits of it, but also to do that because if you put the transit infrastructure in place and get the whole system completed, people will start to use it, it will change preferences, and it will change time. So one last thing that's pretty interesting. You know, Chris was talking about the idea that one of the reasons why we should be doing this has to do with environmentalism. And I totally agree with that. And I do want to lift up one interesting thing, which is that what the polling data tells us is that in California, the people who vote more environmental, who are most worried about greenhouse gas emissions, who are most into public transit, who are most into protecting the forest, who are most worried about air quality, are Latinos, more than whites. And immigrant Latinos more than US-born Latinos. That does not square with what people think in terms of who they think are environmentalists and who they think will support this. We need to change our notion of what America was supposed to look like from this kind of a sprawl situation to a situation where we do recognize the next America and build on the next America to build the next American dream. One important part of it will be the following. You mentioned the Christoph article and the growing inequality in the United States. What you didn't mention in that article were two really important paragraphs where he points out that there's a new study from the International Monetary Fund suggesting that inequality actually damages economic growth, that there's a new book out by Robert Frank called The Darwin Economy, which includes reference to a study looking at a bunch of industrial nations showing that income inequality actually damages economic growth, that there are a number, and you didn't point this out, of studies of metropolitan regions in the United States showing that income inequality and racial segregation slow economic growth, including an important study from the Federal Reserve of Cleveland. The next America will be about looking at these demographics, and the next America will be about dealing with inequality, because unless we tackle those underlying issues of inequality, we will not get sustainable economic growth, and we will not get the kind of affordable housing that Chris was talking about. It needs constituencies. Thank you very much.
We are actually at our time. So we may not be able to do a host of questions from the audience, but the great thing is, as prerogative of being the MC, I get to ask a question, and I'm going to ask thanks first of all, both of you for the presentations. That was a great way to start off, and the thing that came to mind out of both of them, one was, as Chris, as you were talking about sort of the growing demand and sort of how it actually makes very good sense. But also then, as Manuel started talking about the demographic patterns, one of those things that is not a conspiracy theory thing, but it is something that always comes to my mind is that, and it was exampled here in DC when the metro was originally built and the line did not go through Georgetown, that there is, while it makes very good logical sense, there is a visceral reaction disguised in the terms of high crime by having different types of people living in closer, walkable communities, and somehow the notion that someone's going to be jumping on a bus with a TV with a cord hanging off of it, getting on the bus. So one is there any indication around sort of what this means around how much safer communities become when they're denser and more vibrant, which I think the answer is pretty obvious. And then to Manuel's side, and you may both be able to answer this, as the numbers change, the power base has not. The people who are making the decisions are still largely white, largely male. They are the same ones who want to kill Sustainable Communities Regional Planning Grant Program at the federal level. They're the ones who want to, decimate all the ideas and the notions around expanding transit in the nation. And so as the rail Volution, seeks to go out and inspire or really talk to our leadership about this, who may actually have their own visceral reaction to it. What is the conversation that we have with them to get them to change their minds and their attitudes toward this work?
Well, the issue of crime, that in this country we would not have had in this country, we would not have seen the great explosion in the downtowns and in our neighborhoods as they've been coming back over the last 15 years without the crime rate falling, because it fell dramatically from the early 90s. But the question is what's cause and what's effect? And we don't really know that answer right now. Everybody knows, everybody that's a policeman, everyone that's a mayor, everyone that is deeply involved with this particular topic, they all take the credit for it. Every police chief I know takes the credit for the fall in crime rates. But we don't, from an academic, scientific point of view, don't know why those crime rates fell. But I think it's very possible that they in fact fell in this country because of walkable urban development. And because more people on the street results in greater safety. It's not more policemen on the street, it's more people on the street that create greater safety. So that's still to be determined, what was the causality between the drop in crime that we saw in this country and the rise of walkable urbanism over the last 15, 20 years. But I don't think they're unrelated. Mm-hmm. And the other thing to note is take a look at historic urbanism before the Second World War. And if you want to see it, just go to Georgetown. It's walking distance from here. It's about a mile from here. And you can see homes built in the 18th and 19th century. And you can see these mansions that were built by ship owners and by bankers. Right across the street are little two-story wood frame row houses where working class folks lived. At the same time, that's how we used to build cities for 6,000 years. And for much of that time, those cities, not all that time, but much of that time, the cities were incredibly safe. It was only in the last 50, 60 years when we started to segregate people by class, by race, that we began to see this incredible crime spree in this country, which it's still today far higher than the rest of the civilized world. And we still have a lot more to do to bring it down, but it's down 2/3 from its peak in the late 80s, and I think walkable urbanism is a major component of that.
So my sense is that the only people engaged in property crime who take subways to their sites work on Wall Street. So And I think that the underlying tension about extending transit has been, the same impulse that drove suburbanization. It's easy to think about it as just a preference or a policy mistake, but it was replete with racially restrictive covenants. In Los Angeles, we had this whole swath of suburbs that were built under the Lakewood system that had, deeds that indicated that no one who was non-white could move into those areas, and they were set up in this particular way as a way of separation. I remember actually we first bought a house in Santa Cruz, and I pulled up the old deed and I showed it to my son because it said no one who was not white could live there. And a little tear came in his eye and he said, "Daddy, do we have to leave?" I said, "No, this fortunately sort of got struck down because the Supreme Court struck it down in California in 1963, and then the voters voted back racially restrictive covenants in 1964. And then in 1965, the California Supreme Court said, what part of unconstitutional do you not understand? So we have to understand that part of what's been driving this is a kind of racial separation and racial anxiety. Now, in terms of moving things forward into the future, I think I want to echo something that my good friend Angela Glover Blackwell said the other day, that sometimes we worry about convincing everyone, but the civil rights movement didn't convince everyone. They just convinced a lot of people, right? And then began to try to form the coalitions that could move things forward. Now, I agree, this is something where there's a lot of win-win for developers. There's a lot of win-win for people who care about the environment, for people who care about social equity if we do this right. But we're not going to convince everyone. And we need to just figure out where the useful opportunities are to move people along, who the political figures are that can be convinced, and then how do we really start to capture some of the constituencies we might not be thinking about, these immigrant constituencies, young folks, African Americans who are moving to some of the older suburbs. How do you bring some new urbanism into those kind of locations as well? It'll really take advantage of who might be open to this argument.
Great. It is time for us to call the session to an end. Let us thank again Chris Lineberger and Manuel Pastor. A reminder that sessions begin at 10 a.m., but you now have a 22-minute or so break. Enjoy the conference, and let's start a revolution.